If you're like me, you're probably getting whiplash trying to keep up with the number of announced terminations of federal workers from various federal agencies. But while I'm confused, there are a lot of federal workers who are more than confused because they no longer have jobs, because they're worried about how to sustain themselves or their families once those paychecks stop coming in. And here's the thing that some of us may not be considering. The private sector is also laying off workers for a number of reasons. So where will many of these workers go? On this channel, I try to summarize my understanding of news reports, regulations, government announcements, and the like. But this episode is a little difficult for me because it's hard to hear about people losing their jobs, their livelihoods, without feeling something. So while I'll be summarizing, the announcements of, terminations across different agencies, they will sound like I'm just running through a list of numbers. But one of the things that I'm going to keep in mind, and hopefully you'll keep in mind as well, is that all of these numbers represent people, they represent families, they represent livelihoods. And so the purpose of this is not to just provide a summary of all the terminations, but just to have it all in one place for us to consider the real impact on people around the country. So I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a new video series I created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants under the current administration. My name is Patrice Davis. I'm a former federal employee, and I'm the founder of GrantsWorks Consulting and GrantsWorks Academy. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, and you're wondering why I can speak about this topic, as I mentioned in earlier videos, I'm a federal grant consultant who specializes in post-award management of federal grants. I also have, specializations in the pre-award side of federal grants. The bulk of my work and the bulk of my expertise is in the post-award side of federal grants. I've obtained and managed approximately $300 million in federal grants from over 20 federal and other government agencies for over 18 years. And I've developed and delivered training for clients, for collaborators, and for a federal agency. GrantsWorks, my company, is a federal grant consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal grants. Our team of experienced grant consultants provide grant research, grant writing, grant administration support, and grant management training services. And we can even help you manage subrecipients or prepare for an upcoming single audit. You can learn more about me and about GrantsWorks in the details below. On this channel as well, my goal is to shed light on what's happening with federal grant funding, from the funding freeze to agency shutdowns, federal payment systems, what's happening at the Office of Management and Budget, and spotlight how the federal workforce reduction may impact federal grants. And that's what this episode is about. I'll also feature guests such as former federal employees and other consultants. If this is a topic you find interesting and valuable, please subscribe so you can know when the next video is published. So for this short episode, I thought it was going to be short, but by the time I finished writing and getting all the information, it may not be as short as I thought. For this episode of Federal Grants Explained, I'll provide a rundown of the federal worker terminations that, again, outright terminated. But I'd also like to overlay the list of these announcements by agency with the fact that I think about 70 to 80,000 of federal workers actually took the buyout deal. So what I'm providing is a summary of workers have been recently terminated or laid off, whatever the term is. But again, it doesn't account for the 70 to 80,000 who've already decided to take the buyout deal. So that's what I'm going to be featuring. But I'm also going to shed light on how this all is going to impact federal grants. Specifically, I'll shed light on how the following may be impacted. Number one, federal grant announcements, which are called notices of funding opportunities or NOFOs, application reviews, the awarding process, and post-award monitoring by federal employees of grantees. So how did all of this get started? Well, I initially thought we were going to start with what happened on February 11th, 2025, but then I remembered there were some terminations before then. But let's go ahead and start with February 11th, 2025. What happened on that day? That's the day that President Trump signed the The executive order implementing this particular executive order, the name of the executive order is President's Department of Government Efficiency Workforce Optimization Initiative, and that's executive order number 14210. And you should be seeing a video of the executive order right now. In that executive order, it declares that the president has a, quote, desire to restore accountability to the American public, eliminate waste, bloat, and insularity, empower American workers, American families, taxpayers, and our system of government. Also, according to that executive order, DOGE, which is of course the Department of Government Efficiency, should submit a plan to reduce the size of the federal workforce through efficiency and attrition. The EO goes on to say that the plan requires each agency to hire no more than one employee for every four that depart, that the plan should adhere to an overall federal hiring plan, and you can Google that to find out a little bit more, that it requires each agency head to develop a data-driven plan in consultation with its DOGE team lead to ensure new hires are in the, quote, highest need areas. There's more that the executive order lays out. And I could go on, but I'll now shift the focus to summarizing the federal worker terminations to date. I do want to, say hats off and thank you to USA Today, to the Associated Press, and to government executive for their summary of the terminations. I ended up having to cross-check across the three of them because sometimes a certain number may be reported in one particular publication and another number is reported in another. So I tried my best to report what was accurate based on what's out there in the press. Why am I using the press? Because unless I missed it, there isn't a place on the Office of Personnel Management's website. The OPM is the government's Office of Personnel Management. There isn't a place on the OPM website that lists the number of people who have been terminated by agency. So I'm relying on what's in the press. So before I go into summarizing all of the terminations, the firings, the people being laid off, whatever the terminology, the proper terminology is, I do want to start with what happened on January 24th, 2025, just in case you guys forgot. On January 24th, 2025, 18 inspectors general, I've seen 17, I've seen 18 inspectors general were terminated. And as I reported in the last video, the one detailing, what happened at the Treasury Department, the Inspector General, the actual position, not the Office of Inspector General. There is an Inspector General that oversees the OIG, Office of Inspector General. But the Inspector General, and I guess that person's office, they are responsible for investigating activities within the federal agency. So, for example, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services had an Office of Inspector General, and of course, there was an Inspector General that oversaw the office. And among the agency and its stakeholders, such as federal grantees, federal contractors, and other stakeholders, they are actually responsible for investigating government waste, fraud, and abuse, and they're supposed to be nonpartisan. They are mandated to conduct independent audits, investigations, and inspections, and they then release reports to their agency heads. So once they do the audit and the inspection, they then release a report to, for example, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services and to Congress. What the agency heads and or Congress do or don't do, as some have reported with those reports, is a story for another day. So let's move on, of course, to the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I've already summarized all of this in another video that I released here on this channel. So you can actually get the link below. On February 7th, 2025, approximately 10,000 USAID employees and contractors no longer have jobs because, as I reported, there are approximately only about 611 employees left, and they have been folded into the State Department. I do want to point out that what happened at USAID happened before this executive order was released and signed by the current president. So just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. So now there's the U.S. Forest Service, and there were about 2,400 U.S. Forest Service probationary non-firefighting employees fired. And just for some context, the Forest Service is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. and they're in charge of managing 193 million acres of land and the natural resources on the land. And so here's a little video describing the U.S. Forest Service. So here is the website of the U.S. Forest Service. Again, it is a subagency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And as you can see, they are responsible for managing the land. So fire management, forests and grasslands, international cooperation, invasive species, land management planning, land and realty management, and the list goes on and on, urban forests and more. So they do obviously have educational programs, and here are some of the science and technology programs and initiatives that they oversee: water, air, and soil, data, tools, and products. I have to tell you, U.S. government like data and research is, you can spend hours digging into some of the topics, just depending on what you're interested in, research and development. So I just want to give you a little bit of information about the U.S. Forest Service. And so now about 2,000 of these workers have been, I don't know if the correct word is terminated, laid off, or what the correct phrases, but just wanted to share a little bit about the Forest Service. Another subagency or division or department within the USDA, again, that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that also let some workers go, and that's, of course, the workers at the Food and Nutrition Service. The numbers are unconfirmed of the FNS, Food and Nutrition Service employees that were let go, but just so you know what the FNS is, the FNS is the subagency or department or division that's in charge of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Many of us are familiar with SNAP. SNAP is the program that a lot of people rely on to make sure that they don't go hungry. Again, in fact, its mission is to, quote, increase food security and reduce hunger in partnership with cooperating organizations by providing children and low-income people access to food, a healthy diet, and nutrition education in a manner that, and this is important, supports American agriculture and inspires public confidence. So I do think it's really important for you to connect the SNAP program with, again, supporting American culture. So there are two aspects to this that I think a lot of times people may not be aware of. There's a lot of discussion in the news right now about SNAP benefits and whether it will be reduced in the current congressional budget that's being negotiated. But there are some, again, some interesting politics around that, again, because SNAP is intended for two, stakeholders. Of course, those of us in the country who, they want to prevent from going hungry, but then also, of course, American farmers or farming conglomerates. So I'm going to pick this up a bit. So we've talked about USAID, we've talked about the U.S. Forest Service, and of course we talked about the inspectors general. I'm going to pick it up now and start going through what seems like a list, but just remember that these numbers represent actual people and actual families. So about 20% of the Small Business Administration's workforce, or about 720 people who were probationary employees, were terminated, according to a report from Politico. So that's the SBA. Then the Office of Personnel Management itself, the same office that I mentioned earlier, they themselves terminated, quote, dozens of its own probationary employees. The U.S. General Services Administration, which I visit the website quite a bit, or I used to visit the website quite a bit for a number of reasons, but they terminated approximately 100 workers. So that's the GSA. Then we have the Environmental Protection Agency. It terminated 388 employees, with another 171 staffers put on leave who were in the agency DEI and environmental justice divisions. It's reported that some EPA workers were actually reinstated recently. How much were reinstated and why is unknown. But one of the things that you'll hear throughout this video is that there's a cut, then they realize, oh, that's a department we actually need. Let's go ahead and find them and get them back on and rescind their resignations. And this is some of the reason why so many people are wondering, what's the approach? Is there an agency by an agency analysis of the numbers that they plan on cutting, and then where those numbers come from? What departments are some of these probationary employees in? I do also want to point out something that a federal worker pointed out on his post on social media, was that you have to remember that a lot of the new people that are coming into the federal government, they come from the private sector. So they're coming in with a lot of innovation, a lot of energy. They have a lot of ideas. They know how to do things probably in a more efficient way. They're not necessarily a part of that, the wheel yet. They just have a lot of energy. And so, assuming that the probationary workers that come in are actual new employees, there are other ways that an employee could be probationary. They could be in a probationary period because they were recently promoted. They could be in a probationary period because they shifted from Department A to Department B. So not only new people were actually terminated. Now let's go talk about the VA. So the VA, Department of Veteran Affairs, terminated more than 1,000 of its 43,000 employees with the department really now trying to reinstate those who actually worked on a crisis hotline for veterans. That's another example of folks being terminated because they meet, some kind of quantitative goal. And then once it's realized, oh, they met a goal, but we actually need a certain department, then they decide to reinstate them. So this is why some people say that the approach seems kind of random, with only a certain quantity being evaluated, not necessarily a deeper analysis of what that quantity represents, what department these quantities represent. Again, another concern for some people is that, again, they seem random, and they being DOJ isn't really verifying the social safety or even national security necessity of some of the positions being eliminated. And again, having to rehire them. So they fire them and then they have to go, find them because, find them wherever they are, and then try to rehire them. So here's an image of a Williamsport Sun-Gazette story about the VA employees who apparently were terminated and now have had their terminations rescinded. Then the National Park Service is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of the Interior. They are reported to have terminated approximately 2,300 mostly probationary employees of the National Park Service. And here's a video with a snippet of the National Park Service. I've managed NPS grants, and so I'm very familiar with the agency. So this is the National Park Service, and this is, again, a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of the Interior, and it's been around since 1916. National Park Service is entrusted with the care of our national parks. National parks include many of, the national parks that we are familiar with, such as Yosemite, of course, the Redwoods in California, even the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta is actually one of these sites overseen by the National Park Service. Was just looking at a list of the parks. Now, I do want to point out, as has been reported in the news, about 1,000 probationary employees of the National Park Service were part of recent terminations. What we don't know yet is how many of the 70,000 or so that were given the opportunity for the buyout, how many of them are actually from the National Park Service. So just wanted to give you a quick breakdown to help you distinguish between employees of the U.S. Forest Service, which is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the National Park Service, which is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of the Interior. All right, now we're going to talk about the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, known by many of us in the federal grant space as a, quote, super agency. Apparently, approximately 7,000 CDC workers. You know what? Let's make that. It's approximately 700 CDC workers and more than 1,000 NIH probationary employees were laid off. The CDC employees reportedly fired include those in the Epidemic Intelligence Service Division. Again, another example of why I had to check several websites for the complete picture, because some websites said that there were 1,400 CDC workers laid off, another said 700. So where some of these numbers actually are, I'm very curious if the government is going to release, an exact number once they're done with all of the terminations. I'm wondering if there's going to be a central space, the point I'm making, on maybe the OPM, the OPM, Office of Personnel Management website with these details. It was also reported that workers at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services some workers were laid off there. Some at the Indian Health Service were laid off, and then it was reported that some of those terminations were rescinded. Some at the Administration for Children and Families. That's another U.S. Department of Health and Human Services sub-agency. Some at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and other HHS offices such as the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. Interestingly, even the inaugural director of ARPA-H. ARPA-H is U.S. Department of Health and Human Services version of DARPA. And I think it stands for Advanced Research Program Administration. I don't remember. But apparently that person was also terminated as well. Now on to the U.S. Department of Commerce. It's been reported that some workers were fired from the National Weather Service. The amount is unknown and I haven't been able to find that number. Another very important Commerce Department sub-agency is apparently also being targeted for mass firings this coming week. And that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, as it's known in our space or in any space. Approximately 500 probational employees are being targeted for terminations at NIST. So I'm going to let you watch this quick video about NIST. It's a pretty cool agency. This is the homepage of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Again, it is an agency or an office within the U.S. Department of Commerce. And NIST is one of those agencies that I've always admired from afar. We haven't worked on any NIST grants, either on the application side or post-award management. The things that they do is pretty cool. When I click on what we do, look at all of the areas where they specialize, from AI to bioscience, cybersecurity, mathematics and statistics, neutron research, quantum information science. So they really do quite a bit. When I go over to, the About Us page, there's this really cool description of what they do in a really nice video as well. It was actually founded in 1901, and again, part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. It is described as the nation's oldest physical science laboratory. So I'm going to scroll down here to, the mission: to promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement science, standards, and technology in ways that enhance economic security and improve our quality of life. So I'm going to play about 15 seconds of this video, and then we'll cut it short. But I did want to just provide some background on NIST, because I didn't want this video to just be about federal workers being terminated. I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to help us learn more about the breadth of the federal government, so many of us can understand a little bit more about all the different areas where federal government agencies serve us and help the U.S. economy as a whole.
Most people think of NIST as a federal laboratory that only works to improve measurements, but its true central mission is to enable innovation. But how does a measurement agency support innovation? Well, if you know how to measure something, then you can begin to think about how to design it, to build it, and to make it better. And these capabilities really are the essence of technological innovation. Measurements permeate every aspect of our lives, from how we make things, to how we sell things, to how we regulate things.
Awesome. So that is a little bit about NIST and what they do. You can certainly go to the website nist.gov. Check it out to learn more. About 2,000 workers were laid off at the U.S. Department of Energy, including about 325 from the National Nuclear Security Administration. So many of you have heard about this in the news, that 325 workers from the National Nuclear Security Administration were laid off. And then once DOGE or someone else in the federal government realized, we definitely need those folks, they rescinded their resignations, with almost all of them returning to their jobs. From what I understand, about 28 did not come back. But yeah, that's a department you definitely want to be fully staffed. Dozens of employees at the U.S. Department of Education were laid off, about 60 so far, as has been reported. But many of you are likely aware that the Department of Education is one of the agencies that apparently DOGE has actually targeted for a mass restructuring, similar to what happened at USAID, because as I shared in a previous video, actually in the very first video, the administration's goal is to close down the U.S. Department of Education altogether and shift a lot of the responsibility to the states. I'm not sure if they plan on folding a part of the existing federal agency into maybe, I don't know, some other agency similar to what they did to USAID, folding that into the State Department. But I do know, based on what's been announced, that they definitely want to, basically move a lot of the education administration to the states. A lot of teachers are particularly concerned about that because it's known that many times the states don't have the budgets to, support school systems as they currently are structured with just, state funds. So curious to see how that's going to pan out. Maybe, I don't know. So approximately 100 employees at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau were actually terminated or laid off, with more on hold actually due to a court challenge. And by the way, it's been reported there are so many court challenges right now to the funding freeze, to the terminations, and to a lot of the things that have happened since the administration came into office. And part of the reason why is because a lot of these actions are being initiated via an executive order, and in some instances, an executive order, it does not supersede, what's actually meant to happen as authorized by a law or by statute. So just want to make sure that that's part of the reason why some of these things are in the courts. I'm not an attorney. I won't even try to pretend one. I don't pretend to be one on TV. Just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. Federal Aviation Administration. This one's been in the news quite a bit. But apparently 400 recently hired staff were terminated. By the way, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Transportation, who also laid off employees in the Federal Transit Administration. I do want to also point out something that I saw on a federal government website. I can't remember the name of the website. I read it quite often. And they pointed out that the night of the crash of between the helicopter and the plane over, the river in DC, apparently earlier that day, all federal employees had received that email inviting them to take the buyout. So I'm not sure how many FAA workers that morning or that day saw the email, decided to take the buyout, and were gone. I don't know. I don't want to put any rumors out there, but just know that every federal employee, it is reported, actually received that email inviting them to take the buyout. And, so just something to consider. I'm sure it all will come out, but just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that. So TSA, we all like to complain about TSA when we're at the airport. But, of course, they're federal employees. Apparently 243 probationary TSA employees were terminated, citing performance and conduct issues. So, I'll leave that alone. But I do want to make sure you all are aware that TSA is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And something I learned while I was actually preparing for this episode is that it actually was originally part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Kind of random fact, but, those are the types of little details that I like to know. In other areas of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, more than 400 employees were fired at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. FEMA is also, they also had some terminations, and even the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So quite a bit was happening at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the IRS, right? About 6,000 employees have been laid off at the IRS. This was a big thing in the news last week because it's done right in the middle of tax season. I do want to make sure you guys are aware that as a part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a big push in that act, or, a lot of funding actually also authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act for a huge, hiring increase at the IRS. So the executive order has come in to terminate 6,000 probationary employees, even though there's a law that said, hey, we want to increase the number of workers. So very interesting. Again, I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV, so I'm curious to see how that's all going to pan out. As I described in a previous video, describing how DOGE accessed Treasury payment systems. The IRS is a division or sub-agency of the Treasury Department, and apparently other Treasury Department employees that were terminated were in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. I have not been able to determine how many were in that particular bureau, but yeah, so the Treasury Department also had some terminations as well. Now, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the number of fired workers is unconfirmed, but some have been terminated from HUD. Department of Defense, this is, a big one. They're the big dog, the biggest federal agency with reportedly more than 700,000 full-time civilian workers. 700,000. And when you consider that there are actually 2.3 million or so, it's probably a little bit less now, 2.3 million or so federal workers, that's a pretty large chunk of the federal workforce. According to the DoD itself, they plan to lay off about 5 to 8% of its civilian workforce. I do want to clarify, it's their civilian workforce this coming week. And so this coming week is going to be the week of February 24th, 2025. So that, according to what's been reported, it's going to be about 5,400 probationary employees. Other agencies with terminated workers, according to the Associated Press, are NASA. I don't have a number of how many at NASA. The National Archives and Records Administration, again, no numbers. The Labor Department, no numbers provided. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, no numbers provided again. And the National Science Foundation, with about 168 people confirmed terminated at the NSF. So just wanted to give you guys a rundown of what's been reported so far. I don't know if those numbers have changed. Again, would love to have, a central resource that had these confirmed numbers. Once they determine, who they need to rescind and bring back, because they learned later on that the position was actually, really, really important, or the whole department was really important, such as what happened at the U.S. Department of Energy. Well, I won't say that the whole department at the U.S. Department of Energy, the National Nuclear Energy, what's the name of that? Yes, the National Nuclear Security Administration. But again, about 325 people from that department were laid off, and then only about 28. All of them came back except for about 28. So let's talk about why probationary workers. So it's easier to target probationary workers without violating civil service protections. That's it. Some were recently hired, as I mentioned. Some were early in their transitions to another role or recent promotions. So not everyone was, brand new to the federal workforce. Many of them were very high performing and had, recent performance reports showing that they were considered to be high performers, but then were cited as having performance issues as a justification for why they were being terminated. So that's part of the reason why so many federal workers are also really, really upset, because they are known to be high performers. It's documented that they're high performers, and now they're being told that the reason why they're being terminated is because they are, so-called low performers. So it's even more challenging to absorb. So how does all of this relate to federal grants? Well, here are some ways that federal grants could be impacted. And the insight I'm about to share is based on my time as a CDC employee who observed and had access to the tools that generated and facilitated the development of notices of funding opportunity. Again, those NOFOs are the grant announcements, basically an announcement to the public saying that so-and-so agency plans to award, up to 20 grants for this program or for this innovation or for this project. That's what a notice of funding opportunity is. It's a very simplistic definition of one. But I also had access to the process, the tools, and I actually participated in coordinating the reviews of applications, specifically peer reviews, and of course, agency level reviews, and then of course, the process used for continuation applications. So I have a little bit of experience about how that was coming together at the CDC, and that was, almost 10 years ago. The process has more than likely changed or been enhanced, but I'm going to describe the process because regardless of what that new process is, there are still people that are involved. So when I worked at CDC, again, almost 10 years ago, I had read-only access and some other types of access as well to federal aid, to the federal agency side of a tool called Grant Solutions. And that's a tool that the project officers and others in the center where I worked, that's where they were developing the requests for applications, RFAs, also known as NOFOs. So these are actual CDC employees developing the NOFO and checking and triple checking and redlining and all the things that was a lot of that was being done in Grant Solutions at that time. And that's what's actually happening before the NOFOs are released to the public. Once they're released, there are federal employees organizing either the peer review, right? And again, that's something that I participated in, or the internal review of an application or a group of applications to a NOFO. Again, one of my jobs was to do some of the legwork to prepare for the peer review process. This review process is how the feds determine which application gets funded. First, they determine which one meets basic threshold, which one actually followed all the instructions, did all the things. And once it's determined, okay, of these 200 applications, this 125, these are large numbers, but this 125 actually met the basic threshold and followed the instructions. And so we won't review some of these others. We're just going to review this 125 because at least they followed the instructions and, met the basic threshold. Once they decide who's going to get awarded, what organization would be awarded, there are federal workers who then notify the grant management officers or the grant management specialists who should receive a notice of award or a grant agreement. Once awarded, there's sometimes a kickoff meeting between the federal officials and the grantees. If it's a cooperative agreement, and then of course there are federal workers, specifically that project officer, who oversee each grantee. Again, if it's a cooperative agreement, there's more involvement. As a matter of fact, when you have a cooperative agreement, there is substantial involvement of the federal official. So just want to give you an idea of what's happening behind the scenes at a federal agency, at least back then. So that process has likely changed at CDC, but it still involves people, I'm sure. So just want to make sure you guys are aware that federal grant announcements, application reviews, awarding, and post-award management and communication may be impacted by these terminations. Why? Because we don't know to what extent yet, the workers who took the buyout are going to be from some of these departments. So just something to consider that. And I can only also there are also, the people who are left behind, some of the things that they'll have to overcome, the maybe potential increase in their workload because now there are fewer people in the departments that do some of the work that, others used to do. It used to be, maybe there were 5 people who were able to manage the workload. Maybe now there are 2 to 3 left in that particular department. As I mentioned before, the numbers of terminated employees I rattled off don't tell the whole story because it doesn't factor in the employees who took the buyout. How many grant management officers or grant management specialists and project officers took the buyout or were terminated? We don't know. How many budget analysts, how many management analysts, how many division leads that were terminated or took the buyout? Again, we don't know. To end, there are some that say that all of these terminations are being done to fund a tax cut that is slated to expire this year. Others say it's also to do something, with the massive U.S. deficit. And the deficit, there's no question. There are no questions about the size of the deficit and the fact that this is something that the country has to get under control if possible. But whatever the reasons are, let's remember that these cuts represent real people losing real jobs. So I'll end it here. But again, if you found this video valuable, please do 3 things. Press the like button, subscribe, and share it as far and wide as possible. And if there's a particular topic you'd like me to cover or something you'd like to add that I didn't cover or even something I misreported, please drop it in the comments. I do read the comments and try to respond as quickly as I can. Also, check out the links in the description below to learn about the consulting firm GrantsWorks and to learn about GrantsWorks Academy, especially our federal grant funding and management training series. This training is CFRE and GPCI certified with other certifications in the works. The training series is modeled from a training series that we developed for a federal agency, which is now still rated and consistently rated 4.5 out of 5 stars by now over 700 learners around the world. And the training actually helps you better understand federal grants, how they're awarded, about some of the systems used by federal grantees, and about, of course, grantees' responsibilities. I also linked to some, not all, some of the resources and articles I used to prepare this episode, so you can check them out for yourself. So again, I know I rattled through some numbers. I just want to point out again that those numbers represent actual people with actual lives who now are going to need to find a replacement for the jobs they no longer have, and it's going to be a very difficult time for them. So I just wanted to make sure that I always kind of bring it back to the human impact of these numbers. Again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.